halfway through. I'm sorry, new stuff keeps getting added all the time. Let's see, where were we? Liberation movements, and then the stuff I did today. Okay. All right. Any questions from the news, from the readings, last week's lecture? Maybe. Okay. Let the crew handle it. Okay, one of the challenges often in presenting this material when, to people who didn't live through it, who might not read it in newspapers, if they read newspapers at all, is understanding the world you live in today came from somewhere and is radically changed. So, the 50s is often portrayed in mainstream society as kind of like a golden era where prosperity reigned, men were men, women were women, minorities knew their place. Not that they said the last too loud, but it's depicted kind of like in the series Mad Men, except it's basically dealing with, you know, the Madison Avenue ad agencies. Not that I've seen that show all that much. My referent, guess I'm using a word that you might not have heard of. Referent? You know what a referent is? No. You don't. Okay. So, a referent. It's a term out of psychology. A referent is a psychological object. From which you refer to other objects, like, it's like a chair. Okay? This is an office chair. You can tell it's an office chair because it swivels, it has an ergonomic back, you know, as opposed to the chairs that you sit in at the table. Chair is a referent, table is a referent. So it doesn't matter what kind of table it is, you know what a chair is, and that's a referent, right? When you talk about a level playing field, well, it doesn't matter whether it's soccer, football, baseball, you know what a field is, right? It's artificial environment, right? That's set up in a particular way. So you have a referent for it. You can watch this actually in little children. There's a concept, a stage of development called object permanence, okay? Where the kid, the baby, knows that mom still exists even when mom's out of the room. Right? But until they reach that stage, when mom leaves the room, they freak out. Right? And once they get that mom will continue to exist and come back, they're cool, right? But that's a psychological stage. They have a referent, and we call it as adults object permanence. All right? So there's a referent. So a referent is basically like a psychological object for a common experience. So it's not just objects, it could be experiences. All right? So a lot of times when people talk about, so there's like I think I've used this word, but in case I haven't, it's, let's see, the shibboleth. What a shibboleth is, have I used that in this class yet? Did last year. Shibboleth? Okay. We would call them, in the 21st century, memes, but it's slightly different. Okay? So a shibboleth is a phrase or saying that marks a particular point of view. Now this is the old term for it. So it's because it's biblical. From the time of the judges. So the reference is to Judges, if you're familiar with, say, the King James Version of the Bible, where the nation of Israel was fighting against another nation, and this is before our present-day concepts of race, so they're essentially the same folks. They look alike. They're from the same place, except they're at war with these people, and the only way you can tell that they're different is the way they pronounce a certain word. And that word is shibboleth, which in Hebrew means a torrent of water, a stream. All right? So the correct pronunciation for the defenders was shibboleth, but the enemy pronounced it shibboleth.
Wow.
Right? And so they got killed. So who goes there? Say the word for this stream. You say the right word, you're cool. Not, you're dead. Boom. So a shibboleth has since become to mean, in the early 20th century, because of that reference, a particular set of code phrases by which you can tell where somebody's at. Like for black people, okay? Like, I still encounter people who call me colored. Okay, like, okay, you're old and you're from the South and you're white. Okay, I got that. Right? Well, what do people want to be called? Okay, you people. What do you people want to be called? Okay, you people. Okay, so you obviously don't hang around us very much, or else you'd know. Right? Obviously you're not reading the newspaper, watching, all the, black people who are on all the major media, who speak California newscaster English. I'm not going to say the correct English, because, the English would say we ain't speaking correct English. We're speaking Americanese. Right? Right? So all those are shibboleths. I just threw a bunch of them out, right? Just like that. I've done, consultant work where trying to, this group called me in down in Palm Springs to do, it's a group of black people, NAACP and some other groups, and they want to have a youth program, and they want to look at rites of passage. So I said, okay, I'll go down there. So we're at this dinner, and I'm going, okay, so you want to establish an African-American rites of passage in the late 90s, but you're calling yourself Negro. Like nobody that I know from LA, and LA is just 100 miles away, where they have rites of passage programs, nobody's calling themselves Negro in 1990. Except people of a certain age or people who don't want to inflame the dominant group. Right? So that's a shibboleth. Okay, you're calling yourselves Negro in 1990. You're probably not wanting to actually start a rites of passage program that's based on African culture. Because you're not proud to be you can't even get to calling yourself black, let alone Afro-American. You're still back in Negro, the 50s, which is probably dating back to a time when they had some pretty bad stuff out in, Palm Springs, because Palm Springs was a fairly racist city back in the 50s. And so that's part of, what I've spent 10 minutes saying is the 50s, when people talk about as a shibboleth, a time of family values, law and order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for black people wasn't so great. And that's kind of what's being glossed over here. Like when Ronald Reagan talks about, or when talked about, or Jerry Falwell, or all these people are talking about family values. Well, like whose family? And what kind of values are you talking about, right? So it's a time portrayed as a golden era where people knew their place, right? This is time portrayed as ideal for family values, that is middle class, heterosexual, mom stayed at home, dad worked, kids went to school, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Little League, et cetera, all the things that, portrayed American values. So, enlisting in the military, listen, I'm not down on anybody that was in the military. Father's a vet. Lots of homies are vets. That's not the issue. Most of the issue for me is how we treat them when we come back.
Vets in the service are actually discriminated against by their color also.
Yeah, so, yeah. So a lot of different things. So the 50s. So for African Americans, it was a time we were subject to random or deliberate acts of terror with no recourse to law enforcement or the courts throughout the country, and that is to say the land of the free, pretty much everywhere. Just like in the old days, they used to talk about the gay 90s, that is 1890. That was a time of great lynchings for us. Not great lynchings, but large numbers of lynchings for us. Like gays, happy, not before it was homosexual, gay when gay meant happy. So if you've ever been to Disneyland, right, Main Street, that Disneyland and Main Street portrays a place and a time in America where black people could not walk down the street. And if they did, they were subject to arrest or lynching. And that was portrayed as normal. This is why people may think I'm crazy, but I'm saying these school shooters, in the 50s, they were considered normal, patriotic Americans when they did the stuff that they're doing against white people, against black people. Burning our churches, lynching kids, doing all kinds of stuff. These were normal, not considered mentally ill people, American citizens, doing that.
They were condoned, not condemned.
Yeah. Well, condoned in private, but never condemned. Never prosecuted, even when law enforcement knew who it was. Okay? So you have a culture that creates that kind of condition as normal, and you never change it. You never address it. And so the same conditions that produce normal American citizens, now when those normal American citizens start turning their guns, their bombs, et cetera, on mainstream folks, oh, now they're mentally ill. Maybe you should have checked that out back then. All right? So, in the land of the free, there was this dichotomy, okay? We could not necessarily vote, even though we could legally, we were legally allowed to vote since the 19th century, with the Voting Rights Act of 1866. That was the laws, constitutionally, we were under in the 1950s. But there were many places where we still could not vote. In the South, for example, or Southern California. Or Oregon.
Wouldn't they used to make count like a jar of, or have to guess how many like jelly beans was in a jar in order to get it right to?
Yes, that there were black people could be subject to various tests. So not only guess how many jelly beans are in a jar in order to vote, but guess how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. Which was even trickier, right? So, again, a time portrayed as, wow, a happy time before we had all these problems, all these complications. Life was simple. Yeah, it was simple. But for who? Was it simple? All right. So, if you want to have an indicator, take flashpoint issues. Now what a flashpoint is, just so you know, in case you don't know, all right, take a piece of paper. There is a book written by Ray Bradbury called Fahrenheit 451. And great story, great movie. Basically, Fahrenheit 451 is the point at which printed paper will burn. Right? Gasoline will burn at a particular combination of gasoline vapor, air, and a spark. Flashpoint, boom. Right? Before that, you can drop lighted matches into a gas can and it won't do anything. Concentration's too high. Have to reach the right mix. Right? So, flashpoint issue. And one of the shibboleths that you can detect with these flashpoint issues is the issue of, once you have the concept of race, and then racial purity, what happens when people start mixing? And how do people feel about that? And where do they start mixing? All right? So I'm going to use a shibboleth, all right? Einstein was a fervent anti-racist, and he was a genius. Okay? So a person with extreme level of education was for racial harmony and equality of the races. You could make the inference that only a stupid person would be racially prejudiced. You could make that inference, but that's too simple. That would mean you would not be looking for racists who are really smart. And there are some, right? So, two flashpoint issues. What would President Obama say enables social mobility in the United States? I'll ask a more basic question, because it has the same answer. Why are you in school?
To learn.
To learn and?
In trade.
And be trained and?
To get a trade, I said.
To get a trade. Okay, right. All right. Yes, what else?
I think I'm in school so that I can educate other people on things of life.
Okay. To educate others. Okay. So, you'd get paid for that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is an expensive education. You might as well, not only pay back whatever student loans, if any you have any, but get paid for doing this. This ain't easy work. This can be intense stuff, especially, obviously the way I do it, because fasten your seatbelts, we're going to deal with some intense stuff shortly. Okay, flashpoint issues. So, education and sex. Not sex education, though, that is another flashpoint issue. That's a shibboleth. Okay, so education and sex. So, when we talk about two flashpoint issues with white supremacists who are very much in power in the United States in this time, in the 50s, right? The threat of interracial sex, and there's a binary here. The threat of interracial sex between black males and white females. White males and black females is okay in white supremacy. Right? Because of privilege. Because it happens after dark. Okay, who crosses over to the wrong side of the tracks to go to the juke joint or whatever in the South? Okay, when Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley, sorry if you're fans, but they crossed over into black juke joints to learn rock and roll music, stealing it from us and getting famous from it. Okay, they're going into black neighborhoods where they can go because they have white male privilege. Black people cannot go into white clubs. In fact, in the 50s, rock and roll was called race music. Elvis Presley was a proponent of race music because this music was considered black music. Rock and roll and blues was considered black music. I mean, that's a shibboleth there. What's black music now? What's urban? What's hip hop? Once hip hop becomes interracial and international, and you have, you know, Psy, is Psy hip hop? Gangnam Style? Well, you have Korean rappers in America. You have Indian rappers in America. Vanilla Ice? Eminem? There's a difference, right? But who has this copyrighted, right? So this is what happens when you start, you know, contributing to popular culture. So the threat of interracial sex, what the supremacists are concerned with more is black male, white female, even though that could happen under pain of death if it happened. But where it was going to happen, as we will see with integration. So they were afraid of integration of any kind in any public accommodations. That's why they were segregated to prevent race mixing. This even went so far as, like, with eugenicists such as Alexander Graham Bell, who was not just the inventor of the telephone, but as far as the deaf community is concerned, like Hitler. The reason Alexander Graham Bell to the deaf is like Hitler, because Alexander Graham Bell didn't believe in allowing deaf people the right to marry deaf people.
They used to put them they would used to separate them completely off from the community in general.
Right. Put them in homes and stuff like that.
Right.
Because wrongly, he felt that if deaf people got together and have kids, they'd create a race of deaf people. Wrong. Stupid. But that's from the 21st century point of view. Right? He's 19th century. And a eugenicist. He believed in racial purity. He believed in racial purity so much that he believed in creating a separate language for black deaf people and a separate language for white deaf people to prevent interracial mixing of deaf people, to create a mixed race of deaf people. Okay, again, stupid from the 20th century point of view, but people believed it, and Graham Bell, being the inventor of the telephone and having certain privileges and power, could enforce and believe those things. All right, so a lot of these things were taken as fact into this time, the 1950s. People believe this. There were laws against interracial marriage in this time. All right? So, integration of any kind in public accommodations. Up to this point in time, the justification for many race riots, lynchings, is interracial contact. Up until 1965, which we haven't gotten to yet, race riots meant mobs of whites going into black neighborhoods and burning them to the ground with the help of the police and the assistance of the fire department. Like there was a race riot started in Chicago because a black kid who was swimming in the lake landed on the white beach. Like there's no line or sign saying this is a white beach, and there's not much of a current in, Lake Michigan. But, he's swimming and landed on the white beach, and they beat him up and then went to his neighborhood and torched that. Okay, race riots. So when we're talking here about race riots and lynchings, all this stuff is going on to prevent or punish any form of interracial contact. Right? So to prevent interracial contact, they created segregation, sundown laws, created barriers to access to the means of acquiring power, which could mean in this context, education. The law of the land under Jim Crow was separate but equal. They were separated, but in terms of equal resources, they did not get it. It was, so for example, if you're going to look at, access to water. So under separate but equal, whites would get a refrigerated water fountain. Blacks would get a garden hose. They both get access to water. That's equal. Right? But the quality is different. The law doesn't say nothing about quality. You just, okay, they got water, you got water. That's what separate but equal is like. That was legislated under law. Right? So that included not only public accommodations, but school, and not only schools, but how the schools were supplied. Yeah.
We're talking about Jim Crow?
Yeah. Jim Crow into the 50s and beyond. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I don't understand is, so when did, I mean, like, the concept of, like, this person is different or this person is superior to the other, like, when did that start, when did that really start happening?
In Western civilization, about 700 years ago. If that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. I just don't get where it really started.
We could explore the historical roots of where it came from, but if we just talk about here, in Western civilization, basically it starts about 700 years ago. Because in the ancient world, so the concept of race as we know it today was invented about 700 years ago. Because in the ancient world, countries were multiracial. The Romans had black generals, right? So they didn't think they were inferior. When the French invaded Egypt, I'm like reading a biography of Alexander Dumas' father, who was a black general under Napoleon. When the French invaded Egypt, they thought that Dumas was the head of the army because here you have this black guy who's like 6'5" in a horse, and they think, oh, well, he has to be the general, not this little scrawny white dude, Napoleon. Right? But it was, okay, well, hey, yeah, of course. He's the guy invading Egypt, and we're going to respect him, not Napoleon. Right? Which Napoleon would have problems with that because, who is this black guy? And he did have issues. But, the French, had somewhat racial equality, even though there was racism there too. But that's, 400 years after racism was in our current view of it was created and then normalized. So when we talk about access to the means of acquiring power, so education, voting, getting business loans, getting credit, all those were racially segregated, and segregation was the law. We're basically under type 4, institutional racism, and it's legal to do that. So when we look at Brown versus Board of Education, so Linda Brown wanted to go to a school 5 blocks away from her home in Topeka, Kansas, except it was whites only. Blacks were bused across town to segregated, quote-unquote, inferior schools. They were inferior because under segregation and separate but equal, you could both have a school, but in the same school district, but money was allocated differently, not equally, differently. And black schools got less. Okay, so it's not simply that the schools were segregated by the race of the students. Black school children were also being taught by black teachers and some whites who were comfortable in an all-black environment or a majority black environment. Okay, and so there are some white people, that were comfortable with that. So just to give you perspective, you have never, I'll give you credit because of your age, right? Y'all have never gone to a segregated school that was segregated by law, ever. That was not my experience. Though when I went to school starting in late 59, 1960, LA Unified wasn't exclusively racially segregated, but, there's the but, when I went from first grade, I skipped first grade, so second grade to fourth grade in my neighborhood school, which is like 48th and Dinker, Normandy Avenue School in Los Angeles. My mom was a school teacher, but being a black woman could not necessarily find work in LA Unified, so she taught in Compton. So I had the experience of having my fourth grade teacher call my mom in for a parent-teacher conference to stop teaching me how to read because I was ahead of the class. Now, yeah, stop teaching me how to read because I'm ahead of the class. Now, I wasn't even the smartest kid in the class. Smartest kids in the class were this black girl and this Chinese girl that were smart in everything.
Schools weren't completely segregated. When I was
Yeah,
in
right.
school.
Right.
Classes weren't, though.
Yeah. So I went to a neighborhood school that was mixed race, right? But, so because of that incident, my parents took me out of that school and the Watts riots happened, and then as a result of that, I was part of a private busing program where a private bus was chartered and black kids from Watts and South Central were bused to West Side schools. It's called Transport a Child. Actually, there's even an FB page about it. Those of us who like grown up and now, yeah, what was that like? Because that was a trip. I'm sitting in class in fourth grade next to Burt Lancaster's daughter. My sister's having sleepovers at James Garner's house. Billy Mooney from Lost in Space, Kevin Tate. I mean, it's like, okay, right. These are movie stars, kids, doctors, lawyers, and it's in, Bel Air, Bellagio Roads, in elementary school, Bel Air. I trust you know the difference between Bel Air and South Central, right? So it's a trip. Now, when I was at the head of the class in South Central, I was barely struggling to get a C in Bellagio Road. And there was all kinds of resources available in the classroom in Bellagio Road that weren't in Normandy Avenue. And it's the same school district. Okay, so there were differences even then that you could tell in the 60s. In terms of, and it wasn't legally segregated, theoretically, you just had to provide your own bus transportation from Watts to Bellagio Road. And what was driving this at the time was the whole piece with the Lancasters, or Norma Lancaster, wanting, to try and bridge some racial divide as a result of the Watts riots, which we haven't gotten to yet. But, okay, she came to our church, largely black church, and said, okay, you can have an opportunity transfer. What's that? You can go to any school in LA Unified, you just have to provide your own transportation. Well, how come you're telling us this and not the school district? But, okay, cool. Well, how do we do this? Well, I'll just hire a lawyer, we create a nonprofit. What? We'll have a fundraiser at our house? Like, I didn't know movie stars had their own theaters at home, right? Nor did I know from the master bedroom you could jump into this canal which would lead to the swimming pool, which had a waterfall. Okay, All right, right. They're movie stars, right? It's Bel Air, right? I mean, so this is, yeah, it's a trip. So the idea is that I could go and feel comfortable with staying in, my white friend's house in Bel Air, but they didn't feel so comfortable. Only a few of them felt comfortable, coming to spend the night in South Central. Right? A trip that I had to make every day, right? So who's comfortable with going into what neighborhood, and do you get rousted by the cops and LAPD and all that kind of stuff, right? So, all right? So there are some whites that feel comfortable in an all black or mostly black environment, but black teachers consider it their mission to teach to, quote unquote, uplift the race. This is a shibboleth, again, where we're saying, okay, right after slavery, black people want to go to school. In slavery. They want to all go to school. So you see this big thing about education. Okay, we'll read books in our segregated schools, even though these books are like 20 years out of date, and they're like fifth hand, not second hand, fifth hand. So what's happening in these segregated schools is not only do the white schools get new everything, the black schools get the stuff that the white schools are throwing away within the same school district. Right? So, black teachers considered their mission to teach to uplift the race. Therefore, the curriculum wasn't the Columbus discovered America curriculum, but more like what you've been getting. Because I'm teaching from that same canon. So, black students were expected and encouraged to achieve by black teachers who were paid less and had to make do with less resources. Who would actually, if you didn't show up to school, they'd go to your house, talk with your parents, have a lesson there. It was their mission. And they were part of the community and looked up to. And basically saying, no, our job is not only just to create teachers, but to create scientists, doctors, lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And here's how you do it. Here's how we did it. And basically talking from a particular curriculum. So, the issue wasn't simply race, but economics and equal access or distribution of resources. In school integration, the issue was not us wanting to go to white schools. The issue was having the schools have the same resources everywhere. Well, they didn't want to do that. So the simple solution, let's bus the black kids to the white schools. Sometimes they did it in reverse, most likely they didn't, but sometimes they did it in reverse where they're busing the white kids to black schools. Like, that's not necessarily going to improve the schools if you're not funding the schools equally. Having I was born in this year, so, whatever. I still kind of grew up with watching this mentality. So, white schools often got twice as much money, twice as many buses for half as many kids. This is still true in many places. Black residents of Topeka, Kansas in particular, didn't necessarily want to integrate because, one, black teachers would be put out of a job. Two, black students would no longer be taught by people who considered them equal human beings and would teach a curriculum that supported that view. Big issues there. So, behind integration, there's a lot going on. Look, I'm grateful for going to Bellagio Road School, but part of the piece with that is understanding that the inequities are still present. Okay? So, integration was also only going to be one way. That is, from the black neighborhoods to the white schools, not vice versa. Okay? Because their issue was, okay, these black teachers who are now put out of work are not going to be able to work in the white schools. The white schools are not going to hire them, even though they're skilled and qualified. So, a professor at the U of O, Cherise Cheney, has actually done her thesis work on this, U of O ethnic studies. So she there has an article, "What Do We Have to Lose? School Desegregation in Topeka, Kansas after Brown v. Board." So mostly Brown v. Board was the agenda of NAACP National Office, which was opposed by the NAACP in the Topeka chapter in the national lawsuit because NAACP in Topeka wanted, which is made up of black professionals, many of them in the schools. Look, we don't want the schools integrated because that means our members are out of work. And you ain't going to address that. Yes, we don't like segregation, not the issue. But it's a bread and butter issue for our folks. And how are you going to address that? Well, they didn't. Right? So keep their they want to keep their members employed and school children and educated by positive black role models. Okay, the white-run school district in South Carolina, because the suit wasn't just Topeka, but other places. The white-run school district in South Carolina, blacks weren't allowed to vote or run for school board. Oh, not allowed to vote? Wait, this is like 1954. What happened in 1866? School board president claimed at a meeting with black people, "We ain't got no money to buy a bus for your nigger children," quote unquote. So, Reverend J.A. Delane, a black pastor and school superintendent of a black school district, worked for the district, and they were part of the lawsuit. They were suing their school district to desegregate. He and his wife lost their jobs with the district, and their home and church were burned to the ground. Okay, so this is part of the sacrifice, what you risked by actually talking out at this time, the 50s. So great for family values. So Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley et al. Wanted to attack segregation and Jim Crow. And where better to start than with schools, which is why they were doing what they were doing. Brown was part of a series of 5 test cases in the Supreme Court. Key testimony involving research done by a pair of black psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who outlined the negative psychological effect on black children, negative self-image, with accompanying poor performance because of attending segregated schools. So the Clarks, basically, their famous doll study in which you take 2 different dolls that are colored different ways, and which doll is smarter, more beautiful, et cetera, et cetera. And black kids would say the white doll is smarter and more beautiful, and the black doll is dumber, et cetera, et cetera. This is done in the 50s, replicated in the 90s, and into the aughts, et cetera, et cetera. So these negative racial attitudes are still, mimetically viable. All right, so this is only part of the story. Supreme Court then ruled that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. They ruled that schools be desegregated with all deliberate speed. Now, English is my first language. What do you think all deliberate speed means? Like, when does the the highest court in the land just ordered you to desegregate with all deliberate speed? Like, how fast is that?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible, I would think, yeah, right? Right now. Pretty darn quick. Well, no, that didn't happen. Exactly. I inserted this the song, and I don't have a recording on this particular computer. Strange fruit. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant south, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is the fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. In iTunes, you can find two different versions of this, Billie Holiday's and Nina Simone's. Talking about the same subject. So, all during this time, right? School superintendents' houses and churches are being bombed. For black men of a certain age, my age, for example, this will sound strange about black psychology, but you teach children about what they're going to face before they face it, or as soon as they face it. So, for example, my first racial attack, which happened to me in Disneyland when I was 7 in 1962, that evening I was told about Emmett Till. So, the murder of Emmett Till. So this is Emmett and his mom, Mamie.
What's her name?
Mamie. So, he was 14, actually 15 when he was killed. He was from Chicago, urban black. Blacks in Chicago, of course, had more frequent contact with whites without the Southern tradition of having to be subservient. In other words, not look whites directly in the eye because they could kill you. Step off the sidewalk to let whites by if it was a segregated sidewalk. Or actually, if it's a segregated sidewalk, you couldn't even walk on the sidewalk if you were black. So black, in certain southern towns, they had segregated sidewalks. Waiting for whites to be served first in the store, even if you're first before them. So in the summer of 1955, so blacks didn't have to have that experience. Chicago blacks, and also certain West Coast blacks. So, Mamie Till gave in to her son's plea. He wanted to visit his relatives in the South, in Mississippi. So she gave in to his pleas, but before putting him, her only son, on a bus in Chicago, she gave him a stern warning. Be careful. If you have to get down on your knees and bow when a white person goes past, do it willingly. She wasn't exaggerating. Till, now there's two narratives in this story. So Till on a dare said to a white woman, store clerk in Mississippi, Monday, Mississippi, I'll see you later, baby. She was 22 and married, and he was taken, well, I'll tell you the entire story. There's a movie out called The Untold Story of Emmett Till, where a black filmmaker goes back and interviews the surviving members of his family, plus the woman who was insulted, et cetera, plus the cousins who actually hadn't spoken out till he made the film about what happened. The Untold Story of Emmett Till. So what happened is they want to go, he and his cousins want to go to the store and buy penny candy. I don't know if you can relate to penny candy, but this is, penny candy was when a can of soda cost a dime. 12-ounce can of soda cost a dime, right? Gas was a quarter or less. Yeah, so penny candy, right? You could buy a lot of candy for a penny. So in Chicago, as in many places, when you go to a store clerk, why am I getting out money? You put the money in the store clerk's hand. It's a measure of politeness. Or you put it there on the counter, but put it in their hand, right? No big deal. In Chicago. In Mississippi, black people did not touch white people. And all the southern black people knew that. Emmett, being from Chicago, put his money in her hand and touched her. She jerked her hand back. He thought that was kind of funny. So as he's walking to the door with his candy, he said, he allegedly whistles at her and says, "I'll see you later, baby." Now, what kind of game does a 15-year-old have with a 22-year-old woman? Really? No game, right? But his cousins were scared. Actually, they ran all the way home a couple of miles, and they hid in the bushes every time a car came by. They were that terrified. They could not believe that he did that. All right? And they basically didn't go out for 2 days, and then what happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, her husband, who had found out who Emmett was, and came to the door at 2 o'clock in the morning asking for him by name, dragged him out of the house, and they let him drag him out of the house because they were armed, and they never saw him alive again. So imagine what it's like to live in those kind of conditions where you can't actually call the cops because your kid has been kidnapped by Klansmen, or you don't even know who. Just armed white guys that show up at 2 o'clock in the morning because the cousin whistled at a white woman and touched her hand by putting money in her hand. That's a capital offense? Huh.
So where did it come up to, like, because I heard the story that, like I said, like, where he was scared to do it.
Yeah, there's a couple of different narratives, and the one in the movie where the cousin said, "No, we didn't dare him," but said, he actually said, "Well, I've seen white women all the time. I have white girlfriends." Oh, no, you don't. If you're so good with white women, show us what you can do with her. That's the dare. So there are conflicting reports as to what Emmett said to Carolyn Bryant, who owned the store with her husband. By most accounts, Emmett and his cousin Curtis Jones, who was visiting from Chicago as well, were playing with other boys outside the store. Emmett pulled a picture of a white girl out of his wallet, boasted to the other boys that she was his girlfriend. The other boys seemed to think this was just bragging by a city boy from the north. But one boy suggested to Emmett, "Go inside this store and talk to the white woman who was running the cash register, especially if he was so good with white women." That's the dare part. Right? Emmett went inside. By some accounts, he whistled at Carolyn Bryant, who was 21 at the time. Others said he brought some gum, made a lewd suggestion to Bryant on her way out. Nobody black said that. But Bryant testified at the trial that Emmett grabbed her and said, "Don't be afraid of me, baby. I've been with white girls before." I mean, what if he said, "See you later, baby," without touching her at all, which is what, the black people are saying. Like, okay, wait a minute. Really? He did this across a counter. Okay. The word got around about what had happened, and Emmett's relatives suggested he get out of town as fast as possible, which wasn't fast enough. So according to historian David Halberstam, Ron Bryant and Milam tracked Emmett down, pulled him from his uncle's house. They beat him. Emmett was unrepentant, so they decided to kill Emmett to make an example of him. Took him to a river and made him strip down naked. "You still better than me?" Milam asked Emmett. "Yeah," the boy said. Milam shot him in the head. They tied his body to a cotton gin fan and dumped it in the river because bodies float after a couple of days. Yeah.
How did they get
Well,
You see them.
his cousins were in the store, and they basically,
Oh, I know,
yeah.
we're talking about the part where they took him to the river
Mhm.
and stripped him nude,
Mm-hmm.
and dude is telling him, hey, you still think I'm better, you still think you're better than me? Who was there to give that account? You
They testified at trial.
Oh,
Oh, they were arrested. They admitted doing it. Oh, we'll get to that.
Wasn't it later though?
Huh?
Wasn't it like later?
Not really.